All right. So, hey, well, everyone. First off, you're not obligated to like turn off your mic or anything, but I'm going to be talking a lot in the classroom sessions. So feel free to ask anything if you want to. It might be easier in chat, and I'll try and read it, and then maybe we can discuss it through voice after that. But the idea for this classroom is going to be that I'm going to show you guys some tips and just fundamentals that might help you with the relevant week. So this week it's going to be organic forms and shapes. And I'm just going to cover a topic every now and again. I will record this session as well and hopefully upload it to the site. So if anyone missed it, you can still check it out on the website. So for today, what I wanted to do was kind of show you guys how you can go about breaking down organic forms, as I see some of you sometimes have some issues with that. So we'll be going over 4 topics today, which is how you can kind of make organic shapes using a combination of flexible primitives. And then we'll see how we can project organic cross sections in space using simple shapes when we deal with more complex organic shapes. And then we'll look a bit at shading with line, just how we can use fine liner and just lines in general to shade. And then maybe if there's time left, we'll do some fish drawings. Sound good? Okay, cool. Well, so the premise of today is that we're going to be looking at how we can kind of construct or deconstruct organic shapes. And to start off, we'll be looking at our basic primitives, which is the sphere, the box, the cylinder, and the cone, which is basically a relative of the cylinder. And how we can use these primitives to start thinking about organic shapes. So the first thing that's best to think about is the wireframe of which these primitives exist. So each primitive is not just a block of a certain object. Each primitive exists of an actual wireframe like it is in 3D. So if you look at the sphere, we have ellipses running through that sphere, making up the entirety of the sphere, right? And same for the box. Same for the cylinder, which is basically constructed out of ellipses, right? And then the cone is actually the same as a cylinder, but it just goes from very small ellipses to larger and larger ellipses. All right. And now what we can do is actually, or what you should think about in the beginning, is how you can manipulate just these basic shapes. And a couple of ways that you can do that is, for instance, we'll look at the sphere first, is that we have like the, squish principle or the stretch principle, or the bend principle, or the principle of adding and subtracting, which we've covered in other weeks as well, right? So if we look at the sphere, and we'll just do that, here. So what we can do is we can stretch this sphere. I'm hearing some echo of my voice from someone. So if you could fix that, that'd be great. So if we stretch this sphere out, which makes it, you know, we elongate it, basically, we're stretching out all that wireframe, right? Basically making an egg-like shape, which we could consider our first organic shape, right? If we imagine a force, like imagine this is like a sphere made of jelly. If we imagine a force pressing down onto that sphere, we're squishing it. So we're creating the same effect, just in this fashion. Right, squishing that sphere down. We can also bend the sphere if you want to. So that means that we kind of pinch it and bend it. But I'll leave that for a little later. So we can do the same for the box. We can, you know, squish it basically. So let's squish the box. Right. Or we can elongate it. And if we think about it as if it's made of jelly, if I were to squish this box, it would actually kind of push out at the edges. So my edges wouldn't be straight. They would kind of actually go, you know, they would squish a little bit outwards. Like this. And the same for the cylinder. We can elongate that cylinder if you want to, stretch it out. You know, or really squish it, creating some sort of a disc. Okay. So these are good methods that you can practice, just manipulating these basic primitives in order to already get familiar with the principle of manipulating form, right? And at all times try to think about the wireframe which you are manipulating. All right. Okay, so now we can also bend these basic primitives. And so if we do that with a cylinder, what we could do, which we already did in some of the ArtWAD assignments, is that instead of just manipulating it vertically or horizontally, we can also manipulate it in 3D space, which means that I can take my cylinder and kind of bend it a certain way. Right. Like this, and really bend it. Okay, and we can do the same for the sphere. We can change the perspective. You know, if we're looking up at the sphere, we're kind of seeing this line overlap. Right? And whenever you're manipulating these forms, again, try to consider the wireframe that you are also inevitably manipulating. Okay. Another way to manipulate these basic simple shapes is by adding or subtracting shapes. So what that means is that, for instance, if we take a sphere, again, or a squished sphere in this instance, instead of, you know, manipulating it any other way by pressure, we can, for instance, make an indent on this sphere. right? So that our wireframe would actually run like this across, indent, and run over. Right, same here. Until that indent fades away and it becomes a sphere again. Okay, we could also add a sphere to that sphere. So I'm going to do this on the back like this, but we could also do it on the front, which we would need to consider our lines like this, something like that. And then our wireframe would run across and over. Okay. So it's principles like these that will help you think about how you can, construct organic shapes in space, and it will give more volume to your organic shapes. For instance, again, what you could do when you've done all of these, the manipulation and the squishing and the stretching of those simple shapes, you could also start playing with those simple forms and think about maybe, okay, we take an elongated, so I'm going to do this step by step. We take a sphere, we elongate it, and then we're going to pinch it at the top. What would that form look like, right? At all times, think of it like a jelly kind of form, which you can really manipulate. So that might look something like this, right? And then our lines would, or our wireframe would run like this. Okay. Same with your cylinders, for instance. You can just maybe consider that we have just a tapering cylinder, and one that goes, that is, so I'll do this step by step again. So a cylinder like this, and we're going to first squish it. We're going to rotate it, and we're going to make it smaller on the end. So that means it will look like this, go back in space, and then end a little smaller, right? And again, try to follow your wireframe. And your simple shapes will make more sense. All right. So now, basically, this is how we create simple organic forms. And one of your steps that you could do when you're analyzing a real life object is to consider, like, what simple primitives is this constructed of, and how are those simple primitives manipulated? That would be one idea. And then to take it a step further is that you could think about, okay, what combination of simple shapes am I seeing? All right. So for instance, in the case of a shark, right? In the case of a shark, what you could when you see one from reference, or you want to make one up from imagination, is that you could say like, okay, this part is like half a sphere, and then we have maybe two cylinders connected together, right? We're not considering the the dorsal fins or anything at the moment, or the tail. If we want to translate that into 3D space, and we're kind of familiar with perspective, what we could say is we can first start with those simple shapes and say like, okay, I got half a sphere like this, and then I have somewhat of a flexible tapering cylinder, and then I have another smaller, even more tapering cylinder that is also being pinched at the same time, right? In the next step, you could consider that because the head of a shark is kind of flat at the top, it's not as round as, you know, the half cylinder that I have here. You know, it's kind of indented this way. What you could say is you could manipulate that half sphere to make it look more like the head of a shark. Then pinch our ellipse, just cylinder, sorry. Pinch that cylinder just a little bit, going back in space. And another pinched cylinder, right? And if we look at the center line for that fish, looks something like this. And if we then add all the rest of the parts, we can get something that resembles a fish. Does that make sense so far? Okay, cool. All right. So now that we've seen this principle of simple primitive manipulation, right? Everything is derived from these simple shapes. What we're now able to do is kind of see how those simple shapes, because not every organic form is super straightforward like the shark that I'm drawing here, or just the simple forms that I'm manipulating. Sometimes we have very, very, you know, complex looking things that look, you know, just too weird to put a handle on, and then it might be harder for you to kind of understand what the simple shapes of this object is, because if you're good at breaking down complex objects into simple objects, you can definitely define like, okay, this is probably like a cylinder, and this is a very dented sphere, and this is another cylinder. But what you could also do is try a technique that is called like projection, and it's basically the Scott Robertson way, but for organic forms. So what we kind of need to consider is our basic box, right? And first, how we can manipulate this basic box. So what we can do, again, all the techniques that I just showed you. You know, how does, what can we do with basic box like this, and how can we kind of manipulate it. All right, so again, same thing, like you can stretch it, twist it, elongate it, etc., etc. And when you're doing this, again, you need to consider the wireframe with which you are doing that. Right? So the wireframe of each individual part. And when you can project these simple squares in perspective and you understand the wireframe, what you can then focus on doing is how you're going to project a simple 2D organic shape into perspective. Now, for those of you who aren't aware how to do that, let's first take a look at just making an ellipse. So basically an ellipse is a circle which we can construct by connecting the halves of a square, right, like this. And if we want to project this square into perspective, right, we can follow a 2-point perspective like this. And then we need to determine the halves of that square. Now, in order to determine the halves of a square, you probably know that, is we can connect the diagonals and we can find the center line for that square. And if we do that in perspective, you will usually notice that our center line is almost always off center for our human eye, right? So this side is smaller than this side. And if we can connect, we've basically projected that circle in perspective, thus creating an ellipse. Okay, but we can do the same for an organic shape. So let's say we take something like this, right? We could eyeball it, which would actually be really good practice. Right. But you can also measure it out if you want to. It's a bit harder to do, and I'm going to show you guys with a symmetrical shape. So let's say we have our center line here, and we have an organic form like this. Now, if we wanted to project this organic form to the other side, again, my best practice is that you just eyeball it and get familiar with it, but you can also measure it out if you want to be a bit more exact. And that is by, you can connect these corner points if you want to, and then follow a straight line. Follow the straight line across. Same here. This line is a bit off, so probably should be over here. Okay. And for instance, we can find another point if we want to. For instance, this one straight across. Find that line, right? And then we can sort of connect dots and project that shape. Now we can do the same in perspective. Again, we can look for our center line. Draw our shape. And again, make those guidelines. And then instead of going straight ahead, we need to actually follow our perspective guidelines. So we have this point and then following my perspective. Probably end up somewhere over here. Then I need to project this line on the other side. See where the dot is. Follow my perspectives. Connect the dot. Same thing here. Follow my perspective. Connect this line. And I have that. So, and then I can project that same shape in perspective. And you can do this with a lot more guidelines, making a lot more dotted points until you get, the exact same projected shape on the other side. But the thing is, you're ending up with so many guidelines that it's actually useless, and you're not really training your spatial awareness. So in the beginning, what I'd recommend is that you might use like a couple of guidelines, and definitely, if you have the book from Scott Robertson, he goes in a lot more detail about this, and you can check it out. Do the exercises if you want to. They're really good for your spatial awareness. But usually, because we're doing entertainment design and we want to create volume, but not technically accurate volume, it's not that important, unless you're doing something like hard surface vehicles or something. Kind of eyeballing this will be a better practice for just your spatial awareness. Anyway, so the cool thing about this, why I'm showing you this, is that this is basically a cross section, right? So we've been doing these sections in perspective, and you can project any of these sections onto something over here, right? And if we know that, we can project those organic cross sections onto each plane of a sphere. So for instance, if we take like the most generic cross section of a fish, which is probably something like this, right? And we take a box, maybe going in perspective this way. We can think about the wireframe for a lot of these sections. And then we can, because this basically exists within a sphere, we can project that shape onto those objects and follow it, right? Now, the reason that this doesn't look like a fish is because a fish tapers in size. And that's what organic forms do as well. So when you see the organic form of a fish, for instance, what you could think about is that it has like a small plane, maybe a larger plane, and then another small plane behind it. And then we can project our organic shapes on top of that and connect the dots, right? And we can do this with a lot more complex shapes, and we can also shift the squares. So because now they're all neatly following each other, but we could also look at it as if we had a sphere tilted like this, and then one larger tilted like this, and then maybe another one behind it tilted like this, and another one like this tilted behind it, and then one like that, and another one like that, and a super small one here, right? And then we can have these random shapes in each of these planes. Doesn't have to be the same shape, by the way. It can be totally different shapes. But that would allow us to connect that and essentially create our organic shape, right? So anytime that you're looking at somewhat of a more complex organic shape, you should internalize that shape and think about, okay, what are the different cross sections of this, basic or of this organic complex shapes that I'm seeing, and what are the cross sections that I'm envisioning for this shape. It doesn't have to be 100% accurate, but if you can get it into the ballpark of what the cross section of like a Napoleon fish might be, right? Because if you look at a Napoleon fish, I don't have reference right now. Maybe I'll share it in the chat. Just a sec. Like this, right? So this Napoleon fish, like the first thing that I would consider is the widest cross section possible, and maybe the smallest in the back and the smallest in the front. So for me, when I look at that fish, and I'll do it in a front pose first, is that for me, he has like a small cross section on top that fans out a little bit and then comes in like this, right? And if I've practiced my projection in perspective and I want that, I want to redraw that same Napoleon fish in a different perspective, like maybe really looking up at him, like this, I can now do that. Because I've practiced that projection, right? And that's something that you should consider when looking at organic shapes. Always start from your basic primitives and first try to see like, okay, what are the most simple primitives of, what this organic shape is constructed out of? And can I just construct this fish or horse or whatever tree, doesn't matter. Can I construct it manipulating just basic shapes? If it's a bit too hard for that, you can consider like, what cross sections am I seeing in this creature or inanimate object that would help me define the volume of that object. All right, does that make sense? All right. Cool. So now let's look at just a tiny bit of shading. Okay, so why am I showing you guys how to, or actually instructing you guys how to shade an object with lines, is that if you can do it in lines, you can basically do it with anything. Whether it's paint or values, markers, doesn't matter. It's with lines you will be the most effective, because you need to be very careful, otherwise it's going to look messy really fast, or you're going to lose your volume. So I'm just going to show you guys a couple of ways that you can use lines to shade a simple object. So for instance, let's take a sphere again. So we have a sphere, right? And most of you, like the first intention, like if I needed to shade this, and if you, by the way, if you haven't seen the shading videos yet, please check them out, because I'm not going to go over shading entirely in this video. But anyway, if we have our light direction coming from this side, we know that our core shadow is going to run somewhere like this. The reason that I know that is because I follow my direction of my light, which is going to act like the minor axis for this sphere, which then gives me the projection of the ellipse for that sphere, right? So that gives it that core shadow. Now, most of you would probably just hatch it in like this. There's nothing wrong with that, and we're definitely creating volume, but we're not following the form of our objects. And now, in the case of a sphere, it's kind of an exception, because it really does work in a sphere. But like for anything else, if we look at a cylinder, going against that form really does not help the volume of your object. So a better practice for shading is that, and let's go with a cylinder again. Of our light direction coming from this side, is to go with the form. Now, I told you in the beginning of this lecture is that we have a wireframe for each object. So in the case of a cylinder, that would be the ellipses, but also the boxes, right? So when you're shading a cylinder, what you could do is just follow those straight lines. Okay. So we know from the shading videos, if you've checked them, or if you know the principles of shading, that our core shadow is going to be somewhere over here, because the sides of my ellipse are here. So we can then go over those straight lines again to re-emphasize that core shadow. And this gives us the illusion of light with just simple lines. And to practice this, what I recommend that you do is try to build a value scale using simple lines. So in the book that I recommended called Rendering in Pen and Ink, this is described in detail, in a lot of detail actually. And they go over 100 different approaches on how you can shade objects. And each and every one of them has their merits and benefits, but there are a couple of them that you can just use in any other media. So what you could try and do is build like a value scale. And for the first one, you can just do straight lines. And this green isn't best for building that volume, but as you can see, we have a gradation in value, right? And you can do the same with straight lines. To kind of build your value sense, because you're going to use that shift in value and just that, you know, that draftsmanship into your shading. So as you can see, this one is an example of the straight ones. And if we draw another cylinder, we can follow my wireframe, right? Think about your wireframe. But first, like maybe a 50% value. And then re-emphasizing that coarse shadow at like a 70% value or something. Okay. And then we could add a coarse cast shadow as well. Now another thing to take into consideration is that the way that I've shaded this cylinder right now, or this one, is that its local value is the value of my paper, right? Because the halftones or the light area, for instance, is, you know, this color, just the color of my paper. But sometimes we might have like a darker cylinder. You know, imagine like a dark blue or, you know, something with heavy texture. So we would need to indicate that. So the brightest light area won't be as light as my paper, but it will be like maybe a 40% gray. So what you could do then is start indicating that cylinder with like a 40% value. And then re-indicate your shadow side, and then re-emphasize your core shadow and some of your halftones with a darker value, like you did in these exercises, right? So this basically indicates that we have a darker cylinder that is lit the exact same way. All right. Now, a couple of other things to note is that basically shadowing, especially with lines, is a game of labeling. So what I mean by that is, if we take a box, for instance, and we want to shade that box, what I could do is just pick, again, like a 40% gray with straight lines. For the halftone side, leave this one lit, and then go with like a 60 or a 70 grayscale for the shadow side. Now, what you could also do, and what a lot of inkers actually do, is label their shadow or label their inking in general. So for instance, what an inker might do is say like, okay, for the halftones, I will pick straight lines. For my shadows, I will pick like a variation of hatching. Right? And then maybe for my cast shadow, I will do diagonal lines. Right? So that's often what you'll see in ink drawings, and the reason they do that is because it gives a more natural look, because usually everything like the way we see it in nature isn't exactly lit the same way or has the same texture or structure or value in different areas. And so if you follow that principle, you can add a lot more dynamics and interest into your drawings. All right. And the same thing is actually true for, and you'll see this in a lot of ink drawings as well. Let's not consider fish for a second, but if we have a sphere, we can shade it following our wireframe, for instance, or we can shade it with sort of a cross-hatching technique. But that's fine for a sphere because it's a flat object. It probably has a flat texture, the way that I'm shading it right now. But let's say we want to shade like a round bush, right? And that's where many of you kind of usually make that mistake, is that the lighting will be the exact same. We will still have the same lighting principle as a sphere. And so we should consider that for our core shadow. But what you could do is follow the texture of the object that you're drawing on. So you could shade it like this, right? So you still have the same principles of core shadow, bounce light, and lit area. But you've just used that principles and and used texture or applied texture to indicate that shadowing. Right. And the same is true for fish scales. Like if you look at ink drawings for fish, for instance, especially with scales, and if we look at, let's see, carp scale, for instance. So carp scales kind of go like this. Just need to check. Yeah. So they do something like this, right? So in order to add interest to the drawing, you can do a couple of things. You can either just follow the form of your object, or what you will see a lot of inkers do is they will gently get an outline going for the scales, but not too detailed, because they want to give it that natural look. And so what they'll do is they'll again start labeling. But the delicate thing about this is that through your hatching, you still need to indicate the shape of each scale. Right, so each scale should still read as a fish scale, which is, dependent on the silhouette and the shape. But you can use different strokes, and then you can fade out as well. To create more interest into the scales. All right. Let's see. They don't want us to talk about anything else for shading. Nope, don't think so. Well, again, anyway, just try to use different techniques in your shading and just see what works for you. Could you speak up a little louder, Ryan? Oh yeah. Oh, definitely. Especially like the latest YouTube video that I made when I talk about shading with charcoal, is that what inkers will definitely, but this comes down to very experienced inkers, because for a cylinder, for instance, what I'm about to show you now, it's very easy to do. Right, so inkers will actually always consider, especially very good inkers, where the light is and where the shadow is. And if they want to get like a painterly feel into their shading, is they'll group, like I said with the labeling, is they will group their shadings into the same thing. So for instance, I know that when I draw a cylinder, I know that I'll have a cast shadow that will run like this, and then the further you go away from your subject, the softer your cast shadow will be. So, but I want to indicate it just slightly so you guys understand. When we do have the cast shadow of a cylinder, we're actually projecting this top one down onto the ground. So I know that my cast shadow should end somewhere over here, right? And so what an inker will do is that he will determine the core shadow and then fade out. And then he will emphasize that core shadow, but leave the edge of the cylinder in the same value as the shadow, so that when we remove this pencil line, we get a lost edge, right? Which gives us a more painterly look in the overall image. And the same goes for a highlight. Actually, you'll often see, if we take a sphere, for instance, and a normal sphere, if I draw a normal sphere and we have the light coming from this direction, I already created the outlines for that sphere. But sometimes an inker will indicate that this part is very light by just giving it a bit of smooth indication, but then fading it out as we go into the light, to indicate that because light washes out your values, you don't want to create a sharp edge there, right? Because it kind of breaks the illusion. Does that make sense? Cool. Any other questions? No questions? The cheapest fine liner ever, I think. Let me see. I don't even know what this is. I think it's from Action. It's called Action in Belgium. It's like a super cheap store. Like just imagine the cheapest hardware store that you have in your country, and just they'll probably have fine liners, and that's what I'm using. They're really good fine liners. The problem is that if you press a little too hard, you will just break the tip like super easily. So it does require a bit of delicacy, but other than that, I only draw with this actually these days. Yeah. No, they're super cheap, man. If you want to draw like a lot, it's best to get the cheapest pens possible. No problem. Okay, so RPO. I'm having trouble with the transition between the core shadow and the rest of the shadow. It either looks like two totally separate blocks of value, or if I try to soften it, it gets way too messy with different line lengths. Yeah, again, that's why practicing shadow with line, especially permanent line, is such a good exercise, Orikpio. It's like I said, like I showed you here, is try to really practice this. And let me just grab that rendering in Pen and Ink book for a second. So this is the book that I'm talking about. And I'm not sure where they go over value. Oh, here it is. Right, so value. Here you go. So as you can see, you can create like almost a super high range of values with just different textures. So this is what I showed you guys. It's just the straight lines. You can use cross-hatching as well, right? To first go with straight lines, then go with straights and horizontals, then go with straights, horizontals, and diagonals, and then go with different diagonals, and then just go with everything that you can think of to create a darker value. But you can also create darker values with texture. And practicing your delicacy with these, textures, and just being diligent with going from very dark to light or going from very light to dark will help you with those values. I think you run into the most problem when you switch your labeling. So I see a lot of people that, for instance, also with the organic shading, is that you will create your organic shape. You will start your hatching following your contour lines quite effectively, right? But then the other lines already follow a different direction, and then we have some, coarse shadow indication in another direction, and it'll mess with your stroke economy. Okay, so be diligent with doing that and really think about this principle. Like if I want a 40% value, I have lines that are separated like this. If I want a 60% value, I will just have thicker lines that are separated, evenly. If I want an 80% value, I'll have pretty thick lines that are very close to each other. And you can translate that to your shading by first going with that 50% across. And then punching that coarse shadow with like maybe a 70%. Right, and then maybe a 40% for the halftones. Does that make sense? Great. Right, so just the last example. If I'm looking at this tuna fish, for instance, that you can see in the classroom chat, like my first impression is, all right, we just have a cylinder that is squished together, and then tapers to the center. So instead of drawing a cylinder like this, I'm not thinking about the entire shape yet. I'm just thinking like, okay, we definitely have like a squished form in the middle going to an even more squished form in the end, and then ending with like maybe a bit of a rounder shape here, and then I can just connect these, right? And that will basically form the wireframe of my tuna fish. Right? So I already have like 80% of his shape. And then it's just adding in those details like the eyes. But I mean, details, that's all, it's all secondary. Thinking about those major volumes first is the most important. Always also try to consider your center line. And those little thingies here. Same thing, by the way, if you have to think about the head of a fish, like this tuna, for instance, what you basically are thinking about is half a cylinder, or what I'm thinking about at least. But it's a bit pinched in the front, and there's also like, I'm just subtracting a shape. So I'm not thinking about, wow, how does this form work? Like of the beak, how does that structure work? No, all I'm thinking about is we have this half sphere, and I'm just cutting out a piece. Like I'm cutting out this piece from that section, right? So from the side, I'm just cutting out that piece from that half cylinder. And all that is required to be able to do that cutout is think about your wireframe, and just remembering what part you are cutting out. Let me indicate that in red. Right, so this is the part that I'm cutting out, which makes it visually more clear for me on how that shape looks, that organic shape. All right. Yeah, it's 8:10, so that's it for me, guys. If you have any questions, I will give you like 5 minutes to ask them, and I'll try and answer them. On what? On the fish, or? Yeah. Where are you? You goddamn fish. Oh, here we go. Well, you're also just thinking about the wireframe, right? In this small version, I wouldn't even bother making them look 3D. But if you make a bigger version of them, right? It's just the delicacy of considering how the wireframe of that simple organic shape is looking. So I know that if I look at the tuna in this case, I know that we have like a small, rounding going on, and then it probably goes back to a taper where it's completely flat. So I know that I have a center line going through that fin, and we have some, if we look at it from the top, right, we have something like this. This is probably exaggerated, but that's what I'm thinking about. So then I can, through the aid of shading, just or just, hatching in general, I can add like hatchings on that rim where I know that we have that, this part. It will show kind of an edge because light will have a harder time reaching there. So by just subtly indicating that, I'm already, without the presence of those other lines, I'm already indicating thickness without doing too much. Does that make sense? Right. Okay. Well, because it's a very shiny object, the tuna fish is pretty straightforward, but again, it comes down to preference. I could just shade it as I ask of you guys in the tutorial, right? Just by hatching like this and just thinking about the shadow side and the core shadow and things like that. I could also shade where I just see where the planes are changing. So the tuna fish is kind of a bad example for that. But if you look at the top, if you scroll up in the chat and you see the Napoleon fish, for instance, you could also shade by just going to quickly draw his head. Right, so we have something like this going on, right? So what you will see a lot of people do is just ink by following the form, and again, like some sort of labeling act, really just follow the contour and then think about what volume goes where. So the darkest volumes will go at the bottom because that's where the shadow is, and we can clearly see that shadow edge running like this. And so then you can still following just, in the beginning it's always like best just to follow the contour lines of your fish. Like that. I'm not gonna shade the entire thing, but you get the idea, right? So it's a labeling act where you decide, like, okay, I'm gonna either follow my planes or I'm gonna use texture to darken the areas, or I'm just gonna follow the contour of my shape. And just by, in the beginning, what inkers usually recommend is, instead of doing a mix and match of different hatching styles, is that you just establish the shadow and the light side and use the same hatching for like every part, because it will train your value first, and then you can worry about texture later. All right. Yeah, but that's completely normal that you struggle with the shading principles. I think it's just, it kind of needs to click, but practicing it on simpler objects, and even fish are considered like simpler objects, once you kind of get the hang of them. But really focusing on those primitives and really trying to render a cylinder to your best ability, like really thinking about, okay, where's my terminator, where's my core shadow, where is my bounce light coming from, how do I indicate the half tones, where are my highlights, what kind of edges do I use for the cast shadow, how do I indicate the softening, of the shadow going into the distance. If you nail those principles on simple shapes, it will become easier on complex shapes. The thing is just that many people try to skip it, or do it once and think they've mastered it, and then go on to more complex objects. But the thing is, it's like I always say, right? It's always a juggling act, and if you don't understand like how to juggle one ball or two balls in the air, don't expect to be able to juggle 10 or 15 balls in the air, right? So, and that's basically what you're doing when you're trying to shade a more complex object, because you're thinking about perspective, you're thinking about the complex shapes, you're thinking about anatomy, maybe you're thinking about gesture, color, any of those in between. And if you then need to think about shading, your brain kind of goes haywire, because you haven't mastered those fundamentals. All right, that's it for me then, guys. Thank you for attending. I hope it was useful. I definitely plan on doing more of these in the future, and recording them as well, putting them up as part of the website so you guys can consult it from time to time. All right, cool. Let me just stop sharing.